Standing in solidarity. My name is Donna Walker-Kuhn. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm Senior Advisor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at New Jersey Performing Arts Center. This evening, our discussion is mental health and the LGBTQ community, a critical discussion on a very important topic. And we're very pleased to have this illustrious panel to provide insight and action steps on how we can support and be allies. The panel this evening was curated by NJPAC's LGBTQ Employee Resource Group, and we thank them for all of their wonderful efforts. I also hope you were able to watch the film, You Were Not Alone, that was provided in your registration link. The Social Justice Series is part of our Standing in Solidarity initiative. The purpose of this series is to bring our community together and to encourage everyone to take part in the movement to ensure civil rights for all. On our website, you can find archived prior social justice panel discussions, as well as resources that will help you take action. We are also very happy to have as our advisors the Newark NAACP, New Jersey Institutes of Social Justice, Newark Arts, the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Center at Rutgers University, Newark, the director of the Africana Institute at Essex County College, the Asian American Arts Alliance, and ACLU, New Jersey. Now, NJPAC would like to offer a land acknowledgement. The language we're using was created with consultation and guidance from Chief Dwayne Perry of the Ramapo Lenape Munsee tribe and Oleana Whispering Dove of the Eastern Salagi Algonquin descendants. And we are grateful to them for their generosity, wisdom, and labor to craft these words. We, the Lenape, original benefactors of land once ripened and cultivated with attentiveness to the Creator and her ascendancy, express everlasting gratitude to our Creator for the traditional, ancestral jurisdictions of the Munsee, Esopus, Canarsie, Capsee, Iroquois, Illinois, and Weekasqueak, jointly known today as the Ramapo and Natacote Lene Lenape. We are the Lenape Hoking today and will be for the remaining days of tomorrow, keepers of the past. Let this moment of recognition be a monument of action. Let it be the beginning of hope for this our Turtle Island and for the Ramapo Lenape, the Munsee people of whose land we now trod. Here on this land, in this place of the Munsee, we acknowledge our debt to those who have come before us, to those who have been denigrated and suffered for the sake of cultural and land appropriation. Let this, our land acknowledgement, be the beginning of our return to unity. Let us be guardians of the water, the air, and the earth, the four-legged, the flyers, the swimmers, the crawlers, the mammal people, and the green. Let us now stand, lifting our humanity, enrapturing with Earth's consciousness as guardians of harmony and kindness. This acknowledgement demonstrates our ongoing commitment as a community, working to dismantle the continued legacies of colonialism, oppression, and systemic racism. We offer a pledge of social justice awakening and education in order to raise the level of awareness and to ultimately strengthen the communal fabric, which includes engagement with our Indigenous neighbors. NJPAC would also like to thank our corporate sponsor, PSE&G, for standing in solidarity. They have consistently provided resources to enable us to produce this important work. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening's discussion, Reverend Kevin Taylor. Kevin E. Taylor is the director of the LGBTQ services for NJCRI, which is here in downtown Newark. Reverend Elder Taylor is the senior pastor of Unity Fellowship Church in Newark, and he's been in ministry for nearly 25 years. He's a writer and producer for television, and he has his own video production company. Pastor Kevin E. Taylor is a noted author. His books is Jaded, Uncluttered, Because He Lives, It's Time for Some Action, Envy, many other books. And then Reverend Taylor recently released his own autobiography titled Never Too Much. This is my story of big words, big dreams, and an audacious big life. Reverend Taylor is a lecturer, empowerment speaker, and he's spoken at many colleges and universities and community groups, as well as has preached around the country and internationally. Reverend Taylor provides tremendous resources to our communities, and we are very grateful he has time to participate in our panel this evening. Welcome, Reverend Kevin E. Taylor.
Thank you, Donna. Good evening, good evening, good evening. And thank you to you and to the NJPAC family for not only considering me in this capacity, but for bringing me into and having this powerful conversation. We've got three panelists who are going to join us to have what feels like a past due conversation, mental health and the LGBT community. The Standing in Solidarity effort from NJPAC features this month a film called You Are Not Alone, which deals with Black gay men, Black same gender loving men, and mental health and unwellness. And in full disclosure, I've been part of this film that the brilliant filmmaker who was with us tonight did maybe a dozen years ago. And sans the close, the conversations are as powerful and as pointed and as poignant as they were then, they are now. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation because we've something we said in church recently. We're saying it aloud because we're allowed to finally have this conversation about mental health and wellness and what it really is, what it really means, and real steps that we can take towards our own acknowledgement of where we are in our mental health and wellness journey and the resources that we can galvanize in order to support one another now before things get to any kind of place. Now, when you feel like you might not be 100% now, just like you would when that ache hits a part of your body, and to be as mindful that when it hits a part of your brain, a part of your being that doesn't feel as well as it had. And so I'm looking forward to speaking to our three journalists, our three panelists, journalists, some of them are that, on this rich, riveting, and sometimes raw conversation. So I'm going to ask them to come on and introduce themselves under the umbrella of who they are, where they're from, and what they bring to this conversation. So Kevin Moore, please come forward.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Kevin Moore. I'm a psychologist. I've worked for 20-something years with people living with HIV, with people with mental health and addiction issues. And I've treated a lot of folks that have stories very, very similar to the film that we all saw before this evening. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Moore. We appreciate you for being here. Denise Hines from Good Shepherd.
Hi, everyone. My name is Denise Hines. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am the chair of the LGBT Center, Community Center. And today I wear the hat Chief Program Officer at Good Shepherd Services, and the vision of in is family development. I've been doing that for over 30 years, and I am a licensed social worker. And for having me.
Thank you. And so, as you see, we've got two noted clinicians with a great deal of work and walk under their belt. And Antoine Craigwell, the director and producer of the riveting You Are Not Alone documentary. Good sir, come forth and introduce yourself to the people.
Thank you very much, Rev Kev, for moderating this panel, and thanks to NJPAC for hosting us. So my name is Antoine Craigwell, and I'm president and CEO of DBGM. And I produced this documentary, You Are Not Alone. It's 11 years now this year, so it's been around a while. I also produce and convene an In My Mind LGBT People of Color Mental Health Conference that focuses on the mental health of LGBTQ plus people of color. And this year we're focused on looking at LGBTQ plus people of color with disabilities and the issues that they struggle with or they live with. The DBGM, the organization, also focuses on and it's created an ancestral institute to link in ancestral healing rites and practices with contemporary psychology so that Black and people of color can have something to identify with. So that's all for me for now.
Well, thank you, good sir. And a nice way to open up this conversation. So, Dr. Moore, Ms. Hines, and good brother Antoine, let's unpack post-pandemic, where people are having conversations out loud now about mental health and wellness. What is it really? There are so many specialists on the body part, somebody for just your feet, for just your back, for just your teeth. Yet we seem to sometimes hear mental health just as this kind of enigma umbrella of a thing. What is it indeed, Dr. Moore and Denise? What is it? What is mental health?
Denise, do you want to take the first shot at this, or should I?
I'm hearing that my Wi-Fi is not acting right. So
Now it's clear.
can you hear me?
Right now, perfect.
Okay. So the question is mental health. So for me, I'm more, down to earth and saying that, when about mental health day to day, more about the things that kind of keep us going or bring us down. And the things we struggle with that don't allow us to kind of show up as ourselves. And so I expressed a lot of that in looking at film. And, in my work with people, see that young people really struggle with, things clinically described as depression and those types of things. But it's more about the things that keep them being able to function their best selves in the way that they would like to in their day-to-day living.
Dr. Moore.
So I'd love to add to that just a touch, and that Rev Kev, you said that at this post-pandemic era, I think one of the few good things that happened because of COVID is we're talking more and more about mental health. I think it's become such a crisis, particularly among the youth, but really the entire society, that I think we're talking about it more now. We now have members of Congress who can get mental health treatment while they're sitting members of Congress, and that there's more and more acceptance, and that's a really good thing. And I would also say that the diagnosis of depression or anxiety or any of the other mental health conditions are diagnoses, which is ultimately a sort of a system of oppression that puts the onus of terrible social living conditions on an individual and says, this is that individual's problem. You have the depression. And on the one hand, yes, that person has these problems and they need this support, and we want to make that okay to talk about. On the other hand, what that can do is hide the systemic reasons and the suffering and the burden of that individual. And it's really about social isolation and histories of oppression and all kinds of things that really have usually been the things that add up to that. Antoine was speaking earlier, and is probably about to make this comment about how BIPOC youth have such higher rates of depression and suicide, and that is undeniably true. And I think we want to flip that around and say that because of larger societal conditions, that they struggle more, and that this is what this conversation, I think, wants to get to the heart to, is awareness and understanding about this sort of dual reality of making mental health okay to talk about, and then digging further beyond mental health and looking for equity and justice.
Antoine, one of the things that is so powerful because, again, having been in this process with you in this magnificent film before it made its debut to the world, is unpacking how multi-layered this conversation was. You dealt with successful men, you dealt with young men, you dealt with men of a seasoned age, and dealt with the LGBT community, the same gender loving community from Black men in a multi-layered way. What was going on in the world that made this topic be something you wanted to unpack? Because it was really just, riveting in 2011 to be in packed rooms, having out loud conversations with Black gay men about mental health and wellness?
I think one of the things that prompted the creating or producing or even thinking about this documentary was after having interviewed more than 40 Black gay men from around the US, the Caribbean, and Africa about their struggles with mental illness, about their struggles particularly with depression and with suicidal ideation and attempts, that I discovered that there were significant issues coming up in these communities among Black gay men. And the original idea was to write a book to talk about and highlight these stories. Because as I'm sure many of us are aware, that storytelling or telling a story makes it much more common. Because especially when we're dealing with depression, we always feel it's just me alone who's dealing with this issue. Nobody else is dealing with it and nobody understands. But when we hear someone else's story, we're able to say, oh, that sounds like me. That sounds like it could be me. That sounds, and I can identify with that. And so after having done these interviews, and I couldn't get a publisher, because at the time, nobody was interested in publishing stories about Black, gay, and mental health. Those are three significant subject areas. So I decided to then do a documentary because I figured that, well, more people respond to visual images. And so a documentary might be the way to go. So a number of the people who participated in interviews consented to being on screen and to being videotaped, being filmed, and the documentary came to be. One of the things that I think is particularly telling about the documentary is that it's not just voices of Black gay men talking about the things that precipitated their descent into depression and suicidal ideation, but we hear commentary from religious leaders like yourself. We hear commentary from a Muslim imam, but we also hear commentary from mental health professionals and therapists who opine on particular aspects of factors that contribute to Black gay men's mental health destabilization and descent into depression and suicidal ideation and attempts.
So if I could, this might sound like a crass question, and I don't want it to be, because again, when we look at our physical health and wellness, we kind of know triggers. Ouch, my knee keeps popping, my tooth aches. How does clinicians, especially Dr. Bourne, Denise Hines, how does one know when one is has passed that moment where something or somebody or the world is getting on your nerves, or all the things that are part of the stigma of us not wanting to deal with mental health and wellness, and knowing that something is wrong, that you've been triggered, that there's an old trauma coming up? How can somebody, because mental health and wellness is the thing that people really do try to self-diagnose. Like, I just need a mental health day, right? And then they don't do anything about their mental health or the day. They just go away from people, and then they come back and people are still there. How does one kind of take this moment and signing up for this conversation to do some self-analysis that gets you to this place of taking a needed next step? Denise?
You're muted, Denise.
Muted, Denise. Yeah. So Kevin, you go ahead. Dr. Moore. Dr. Moore, you answer, and we'll bring it back in.
Fair enough. So I'm going to give a twofold answer again. I think that when something is harmful, when someone is suffering and it's not going away. I mean, we all suffer ups and downs in life, and you talk to your loved ones and you try to take care of yourself, and that doesn't cut it when it's a mental health disorder. It's the next level of you do those things and still you're suffering and still you're not functioning in the way that you did before. I think that's when we want to reach out for help. And on one hand, we want to normalize that and make that have high quality treatment for everyone, readily available within their means to afford, and to make this a value on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a long tradition of psychotherapy not being something that BIPOC folks are interested in, are engaging in, finding utility in. I think, and that's there's a lot of reasons for that. We can unpack that too. So that might not be the way. There might be other ways. Going to pastoral counseling, to religious leaders, to deal with sort of other problems in other ways. And also, and that's just what the individual should do. I think what we want to do, I think, in this conversation is look at what should the larger society be doing to alleviate the conditions under which people are becoming anxious and depressed and suicidal and so on. And so that's really the work, I think, of mental health that we want to move towards, is to have the whole society be more just, so that individuals don't have to shoulder the burden of healing themselves when they are the victims of larger forces.
Denise, I see you with us.
I think a lot of what we look at, what we talk about in the work that I do, really being aware of your own triggers, the things that really make it difficult for you to show up ourselves, and then trying to figure out what things can help you when you start to feel those triggers come. Those triggers are those past triggers oftentimes. And then, like, just being aware of certain days, certain dates that are significant to you, and trying to think about ways to kind of help you get past those situations, or even preparing for something that may be up that is a trigger for you. So we really try to talk about that, and also just understanding that a lot of, especially I come at from the point of view of working with young people, and for a lot of young people, the traditional getting support necessarily work for them. So looking at kind of non-traditional therapy, arts, through sports, just having relationships one-on-one with mentors, those types of things be really supportive to one's mental health.
So, Antoine, I want to flip questions on you, because you brought something up in our conversations before we went live that I think are really pivotal and germane to this dialogue. You talked about unlearning cycles, because Dr. Moore talked about, for us culturally, for a number of people of color, a number of people culturally, the idea of people talking to people being in your business, not wanting people to know nothing leaves this house, can play a role. But when we got stuck in the house with nobody but self, and those things still came up, you know, people came out of this, emerged out of this in a new way. How do we begin to unlearn these cycles of thinking that somehow we're a person who's also supposed to be an isolated island?
I think there are a couple of things in your question that you're just talking about there, Rev Kev, which I think we need to really and truly step back and look at. Dr. Moore and Denise were talking about addressing mental health from a systemic perspective. But I'm also thinking, when I hear them talking about this, I'm thinking of the cultural dynamics that are part of who we are. And I want to take us back a little bit on a little bit of I'll see how brief I can keep this as a history lesson. And you raised something just now, which alluded to that, is that mental health has always existed in all of us as humans since we've walked the face of this earth. It's always been a part of our lives. And I put to you, Rev Kev, that our ancestors had devised and refined methods and practices to heal themselves and each other. But through transshipment, ownership, property, and enslavement, our culture was rooted out from us excised from us, and in its stead was replaced a Christian paradigm that did not really and truly satisfy the needs for the people. Our families, our ancestors knew how to take care of themselves, but out of fear of separation, because for many of our ancestors, separation was worse than death. Out of fear of separation of family members who may not be doing well or feeling well, there was an injunction in the family. We don't talk our business. We don't tell anybody because we don't want the massa to know that so-and-so is not feeling well, that so-and-so is not doing good. Because if the massa finds out that so-and-so is not doing well, then the massa may take so-and-so and sell so-and-so or kill so-and-so. So we would want to protect our family member. So even if we have to bury that person under a whole lot of clothes in the back room.
Or put them up in the attic.
Huh?
Or put them up in the attic. I mean, let's.
Or hide them.
Yep.
And swear everybody to secrecy. So that kind of coping mechanism, that kind of tool has what has come down to us today. So that in our respective Black families, whether you're in America or in the Caribbean, you don't talk your business to strangers. And then, given that a lot of health care and mental health care has always and still continues to be very white oriented, that there is a significant amount of mistrust of both health and mental health care, that we don't know what they're going to do for us. We don't know what they're going to do to us. So we got to keep quiet. We're not going to them. We're not talking to anybody. Now, I was hoping that a little later on I'd bring this in, but this also comes in, and Dr. Moore kind of alluded to it a little bit, is that one of the things why we need to talk about mental health professionals, I saw somebody ask a question in the chat, is that mental health professionals today, especially Black and people of color mental health professionals, have to begin to get in touch with their own ancestry, get to know their own story, and begin to move away, not entirely because there are some merits in the Western European and American psychoanalytical construct, but begin to see how can I incorporate into my story, into my ancestors' language, into my ancestors' culture and beliefs and healing methods, elements from the Western European and American construct. And the reason I say that is that both the WHO and the European Union and some aspects of both APAs have come out and said and recognized, first, the role of racism in mental health care, and secondly, that American and Eurocentric mental health care is a symptomology response paradigm.
So Antoine.
And they're talking about now looking at a more holistic paradigm.
Right. But I hear what you're saying, and it sounds very good clinically, but we have people who have opened up to this new dialogue because, quite frankly, in entertainment, like Being Mary Jane, like, you know, Jane the Virgin, you had people of color engaging people of color clinicians. And so they weren't having the conversations that they were having in Kramer versus Kramer in 1977. And now people are open to maybe finding a clinician who looks like them, who sounds like them, and who engages like them. But Sharon Falcon online asked in the chat room, do we even have enough clinicians now? Because, you know, people have stood up and said, wait, I'm in trouble. And now you're asking the people, you know, now people have become almost like case managers, social workers, where people expect them to have a load of 90 people, where it's impossible. How, Denise, how, Dr. Moore, how are we dealing with, now you've got apps out here saying you can do it by telehealth. You don't even need to leave home. How do we get people to have this rich conversation about mental health and wellness when they're seeing clinicians they're seeing You Are Not Alone and thinking, well, maybe my mom and dad were in this archaic space because now this person looks like Denise. They look like me. And so maybe I could have a conversation with her where the unspoken is understood.
I mean, first and foremost, we need more people of color into the social schools, going into psychology, just, signing up to do the work, right? We don't have enough mental clinicians, and we don't have enough that, our folks are seeing themselves in those folks. So the more we can support and encourage folks to get into the better. To go into social work and talk to people, to get a sense there's a world out there where there are folks who really need them and they continue on in this path. But I think that's definitely an area that we have to work on because many people kind of grew up in the world where, like Antoine was talking about, where going to see a social worker or a therapist was not in the cards. They were told by their parents. I was told by my Caribbean grandparents who raised me that you do not discuss family matters outside the home. So these are things that we kind of have to do 360 for young people to get them to appreciate that and then get them to think about this as a field of operation for themselves. So I'm encouraged now. I was on screen with 15 graduate students, and I would say 90% of those students were people of color. So that is quite encouraging to see that in this shift. But we need a lot more than that.
And Laura in the chat says, it is also important that we have care providers who openly identify as LGBTQ. But how do we do that, Dr. Moore? Because at the end of the day, Denise and Dr. Moore, especially as clinicians, you can have a pride flag on your wall inside the office. What that says to the patient, the client, is that you are safe here. They don't necessarily know that to be your truth if it's not on your hat and on your, you know what I mean? Exactly. So how do we do that when what the truth is what you're looking for is a cultural competency where things are understood and you feel free to engage without changing pronouns and not, the same church stigma.
Cultural competency, and then there's this new that people talk about that I love called cultural humility, where, whether or not you are a person of color or not you are LGBT, having that cultural humility to want to learn more about the person that's in front of you so that you can give them the best of what they need. To me, that's sauce,
Right. Dr. Moore?
I'm not sure I can add much to Denise's comments. I think that's exactly right. I think that the fields of the behavioral health fields of psychology and social work and the others, they need to be more culturally humble and curious and learn, and we need more of everything to expand. And I think it's part of our job to create an environment of safety where people can talk to us about things that they have been told throughout their lives to not talk about, and that's the thing that's making them sick. And we can help with that if we can develop trust. I also think that and I sort of said this before, I also think that there's limits to what even the very best therapist can do. Even if it's a queer BIPOC therapist working with a queer BIPOC patient, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the right thing for that person either. And we need a variety of many other ways of addressing mental health issue on the large societal level also, in order to help the individual patient, in addition to having access to good, well-trained and engaged clinicians that are not burned out from seeing 80 people in a week, which is basically all of the people that I know. So,
and Sue just dropped into the chat something really pivotal that we've heard a little bit about. She said one way to close the mental health gap is to train people in mental health first aid. We've been hearing about that, especially in the season of the police being called into a situation where it's really something mental health and wellness. What is mental health first aid, before we continue the conversation?
Well, I'm a nationally trained mental health first aid.
All right, then. Go ahead, Antoine. What is mental health first aid and how could that
Mental health
help
first
in
aid,
these
very
emergency
simple.
circumstances?
Mental health first aid, very simply, is providing the equivalent of CPR, but for the mind.
Ah.
It's very simply, as a mental health first aider, you would be the first person to respond to somebody in a mental health crisis to help them calm down, be stable until a professional gets there. But as a mental health first aider, your role is also to help prevent someone from going into crisis. So that if you can recognize certain signs and symptoms, some behavioral things, some historical things, and you're able to intervene and work with that person. Mental health first aid that has been adapted from the Australian model and licensed in the US uses 5 action steps, and they call them the ALGE steps. It's first, assess for risk of suicide or harm. The second is listening non-judgmentally. The third is giving reassurance and information. The fourth, which we call E1, is encourage professional support. And E2 is encourage self-help and other support strategies. So the mental health first aider would be the person who would, using those 5 action steps, depending on the context, depending on the situation, apply any one of those 5 because they don't necessarily go in that same order. So I may see someone, for example, who is beginning to decompensate in their behavior and their dress. They're beginning to change from being well-kept to being sloven, okay? Being not taking a shower, wearing the same clothes for 2 weeks or more, and they're beginning to decompensate. So I can step in and I can say, what is happening? How are you doing? Okay, and begin to engage that person in a conversation so as to get them to find out what's going on and then get them the appropriate help. So first, it's listening to that person. Because very often, what we also are aware is that many people are not listened to. They don't think that people can hear them.
Right.
And very often, too, many people are afraid to share and to talk their stories because of how they feel they will be judged. And out of that judgment comes stigma. And from that stigma comes shame and discrimination. And then out of all of that come ostracism and marginalization. So they don't want to talk because you're not going to understand me when I talk.
And so, Antoine, that understanding, because Avery said in the chat, and everybody just chime in, is also understanding that providers are as community members, are not monolithic. So you said this, Dr. Moore, somebody thinks if I find a Black gay male therapist, he'll get everything. But it also almost like and then I won't have to say anything. And the truth is the process is, it might be a therapist, much to your point, Denise, about cultural humility. It might be the therapist who looks like your 5th grade teacher, who calms everything about you down and speaks to that child who's a white woman from Connecticut, but she's competent in the capacity to be able to let you be yourself. And there is something untriggering about their presence. And so we've got to be mindful of that because, in so many ways we think it'll look like what we want it to look like. And it needs to feel like what safe feels like. And Antoine, let's unpack this because in the film, there are kind of 6 general themes that you have always used as talking points. So let's unpack those talking points if we could, in order to be able to see some of the things that have been piercing conversations for us that unpack the conversation of mental health and wellness in the community. Let's talk about acceptance of self and from family and the roles that has played in people not necessarily paying attention to their best self, because it's born out of stress. It's got stigma and shame and all this stuff in it. So we think it's just a part of being, How do we get people to the place of loving and accepting self in order to be able to say, and there might be some stuff that I brought from childhood, some triggers from my journey forward, my journey out, that are still with me, even though I'm successful, even though I look great, even though I'm living well? How do we get there? That first step of acceptance.
Who's that for?
For Dr. Moore, and we'll just round robin that one.
The question is so beautiful, I'm afraid to even attempt an answer. I pass.
So if a client comes to you and they're doing well, successful,
Yes.
the whisper is still, I still only know how to pick up guys on Jack because I truly don't go out yet. 42.
So
don't go out.
Someone who's functioning well but sort of wants to talk, there's always a deeper story. We've all suffered trials and tribulations, and I also think that there is so much to unpack in terms of histories of oppression of all kinds. But let's if for example the client is a Black gay male, I would start asking about internalized homophobia and what ways that even though they're out, that they still struggle with that, perhaps. I would ask them about their experience of race and what their experience of discrimination and whatever has been, and talk about those things. And I think that even someone who's very high functioning would probably benefit from those two conversations just right off the bat, and many other ones underneath that. Oh, and being male, did I mention that? Did I mention that in our culture, being male is a thing where you're not supposed to have emotions, except anger? Anger's okay, but that you're not supposed to have other feelings, and that maybe they probably definitely do, and that maybe they might not have full range of access to those emotions, and that might be something about being male is something to talk about. Just off the top of my head. Again, your question's better than my answer.
So there's a wonderful discourse and information being dropped in the chat. So I hope that everybody who's in the conversation on the back end of this will come in here and pull out some of these questions and articulate some of this data. But I want to get to Antoine's 6 points, because there's a self-acceptance of the acceptance of self and family. Denise, there's sexual abuse. How do we begin to have those conversations in the light of day, especially when people can sometimes believe they've moved on beyond it? Like it was from the childhood, now I got nice labels on and they can't harm me anymore. But if you look just at an overview, you can see how it's still showing up in pieces and parts of their lives. How do people begin to address that when they find themselves re-triggered?
That triggering point is what brings people to therapy. Like something has happened that triggers them, and some things or some memories. And I think that's the entry point, right? You show up somebody's door and you say, I need help, or I want to talk. And then I really believe you have to meet people where they are. And so, they're ready to talk about that. They'll be to the forefront. Sometimes it takes a while. Some people, they come, that's what they want to talk about. For other people, they come in with 5 other reasons. Then slow over time, you can peel the onion, the layers, where but regardless, you're gonna get there when they're ready. And I firmly believe in not pushing people until ready to get to that point.
Antoine, the third point is one you unpacked just unnervingly with me, and You Are Not Alone, and that is religious-fueled homophobia and the roles that it can play in the adult progress and process of a person. How do we, get beyond that when it plays such an ingrained role in culture, in community, and in some folk, even in identity?
I think you're baiting me, Ref Kev.
You baited me. We had this conversation a dozen years ago, and it lasted 2 hours. So
I think you just throw a fishing rod at me and just expect me to go jump on that hook. But I'm gonna go on that hook because you know my role, you know my views on how religion has contributed significantly to mental health destabilization. Because as Dr. Gardier says in the film, we all want to belong. And as you talk about also in the film, that if when you're going to church from 9 in the morning until 9 p.m. and you're there all day, this is where your family is on a Sunday and you belong there. And when you don't belong because of your sexual orientation or gender identity, you are cast out, you are cut off. And this is where we go back to what I described earlier when I talked about the ancestral place that we have that resides in us, in our DNA. We carry that ancestry with us, as well as we carry the trauma that our ancestors experienced. We also carry their healing abilities in our DNA. And watch this.
Come on.
In many of our ancestral communities, because if you go look and read the book Boy Wives and Female Husbands, or you look at homosexuality in African cultures, you will see that there exists in many African cultures, indigenous cultures. For example, among the Native Americans in the United States, there are at least 3 different gender identities. Among the Indonesian people, there are at least 5 determined gender identities. Among the Indians, pre-British colonial invasion, there were 3 gender identities. So among indigenous African peoples, you had LGBT. In some cultures, there was not even a word to describe LGBT. There wasn't even a word because they were just part of the community. They were part of families. They were accepted for who they were. Enter Christianity and white men's fear of sex and sexuality, because Christianity does not even discuss sex and sexuality between heterosexuals, much less between homosexuals. And so you've got that come in as a replacement for indigenous cultures, and that takes over as equivalent of like a cancer into our psyche, into our thinking, into our minds. And again, if you do not belong, then you're cut away, you're ostracized, you are put to the side, you do not belong. And we were talking earlier, and I'm going to come back to this in a sense, that there is research that tells us that when a mother, one mother, accepts her son for who he is able to become a well-adjusted member of the community, of society, because at least he knows my mother's got my back. But when his mother does not accept him for who he is, and when the mother will choose her religious beliefs over her own child and demonize her child because Jesus said, and because there is no homosexuality, and because it's an abomination, and because it's a sin, he no longer feels he has someone watching his back. And so he will then go out and become devious and conniving as a form of survival. Because in the home, he is told and he's seeing it, we don't want any of your kind in this house. We don't want any of that. So you need to be. So he will then create a dual personality. The one who conforms in front of his mother and the one who is out hiding. During the COVID pandemic, we were putting together the In My Mind conference on youth. And I was in touch with a young man who is a student leader at a university in New York City. And he said to me that he is part of an LGBT community at the school. And because of COVID pandemic, a whole lot of students were now restricted and confined at home. He says many of those students had increased anxiety and stress because they could not be themselves as they're accustomed to.
Well, let's say that in the real way. They were trapped in the house with their oppressor. And
so what he said is that he was text chatting with many of them who went to the bathroom, put on the shower, so that they can text with each other and they can text with him to let him know how they were doing. Many were also subject to physical and sexual abuse during the lockdown. Many were also sneaking around and using alcohol and other substances as coping mechanisms during lockdown. We saw that for example, in New York City, the rates of HIV as well as the rates of substance use and alcohol consumption skyrocketed during the lockdown, including, added to that, other transmittable sexually transmitted infections. So we see a rise in chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis.
Because people went, as you just said, to that back to that dark behavior that they were used to. I may be trapped. I might be trapped inside and not able to go to work and can't go to the supermarket, but I can get to a back alley, a glory hole, a place to unpack this. And so, because you're talking about that, Natividad asked this question that I don't want us to skip over. It says, if we BIPOC young people go to these psych and social work schools, how do we not lose ourselves to those systems? Do we have to give ourselves to the Western systems and not have our perspectives heard? Is it possible to create holistic perspectives or even just space to look back at our ancestry within these systems? Because again, we just said, get more in school, but the system hasn't changed yet.
Rev,
How do these young people bring their concern for community into a system that might whitewash it?
Let me just point out something here. I lecture every year at a medical school in New York City on cultural sensitivity. And one of the significant factors about that lecture is that I point out to potential doctors and doctoral students and master students in pharmacology and osteopathy that an equivalent of 5 hours are spent in any medical school on LGBT issues. 5 hours out of 4, 5, 6, 7 years, 5 hours. Secondly, how can we expect clinicians and therapists who are not trained or exposed to multiculturalism, to cultural dynamics, to bring into the therapy room their biases? How could we expect that not to happen? Because how many mental health training institutions, how many mental health clinicians programs include significant components on cultural sensitivity?
Absolutely.
Understanding the role of ancestral rites and practices and how to incorporate them. Which brings me to our Ancestral Institute I was talking about earlier.
You get to leave them with that. Don't shoot that rocket yet. I want to make sure it's held in its own context. Because Brother Shakir asked this question to the clinicians: how do we unpack the fact that everyone needs mental health counseling, including the clinicians themselves? How do we unpack that? How do we make it part of the conversation? Because again, in those movies, if a person asks their therapist a question, the therapist almost brushes it off like, this isn't about me, when it could be an opportunity. You know, when people ask me, you know, I say I have a spiritual director who I go to for spiritual counseling, and I'm a therapist. Because otherwise I'd have long ago lost my mind trying to carry all of this. So how do we destigmatize, this is a question from earlier, because so the two clinicians, how do you take care of yourselves?
Yeah, self-care is critical to doing the work, because without that, number one, you're not going to be able, and you will burn out. So we do a lot of training and support for social workers and caseworkers who are on the front lines doing the work. And Dr. Moore probably talk more about the more clinical therapy, traditional therapy. Us, it's really about, we prove self-care constantly. Our staff, they need to know their triggers, and they need to know when to take care. There's that vanity, you know, being the mask on yourself first before you turn the child on the main. It's the same thing. You cannot give that self to someone without taking care of your own self. So that's where we come in from.
Dr. Moore, how does Dr. Moore take care of Kevin? Or how does Kevin take care of Dr. Moore?
I do terrible self-care. I'm definitely the wrong person to ask, but I do have a standard answer for you. It is part of the tradition that all therapists should be in therapy. That's been a long sort of standing tradition that I think is ongoing. So I appreciate the question. The other thing that might be less well known is it's important to have ongoing supervision, meaning a more senior clinician as someone else that they feel like they can learn from, or at least a group of clinicians doing similar kinds of work, supervising each other and providing professional support so that we can uh, uh, um, continue to do our work as well as possible. Continued professional learning, continued competency, continued humility, continued engagement, and conversations like this evening, I would say are all part of what self-care I think looks like for a clinician in 2023.
There's a quote I heard once that is shifting the way I show up in the world. And it's the older I get, the older gets. Because one of the points that unpacked in You Are Not Alone is growing old, especially in the LGBT community where ageism is already an issue. And then you got, the overwhelming energy of, the fear of the first pandemic we endured, which is, HIV and AIDS, and we didn't die. Even people who are positive and live long enough for drugs and treatments to keep them healthy and well. But that didn't change the guidelines at the club, the age factor, da da da. So how do we talk about the guidance of health and wellness for a community that went through the cultural stuff of we don't talk to anybody, who now at 50 something might really need to talk to somebody and be open to it?
So I'd love to jump in on that one because I have a lot of thoughts about that, because clearly anyone who's old is someone who's older than me, right? I mean, that's obvious. But I think a more real answer is the point earlier about sexually transmitted infections. Just one statistic: 1 in 5 people, period, in America has a sexually transmitted infection. Okay, this is beyond an epidemic. This is and that includes all, not just HIV, but like all of them, right? But still, that's just such a prevalent thing. And I want to talk about the experience of many of the people that I've worked with, which is that they are gay folks who got HIV, who lived through the era when all their friends died, and now they're older and they're tired of condoms and they're tired of taking pills and they're tired, like they enough already. And a pandemic, are you kidding me? They're and they are could continue to be at risk. And there's just a lot of things about aging and sexuality that I wanted to just mention here, that there's some older guys that are very sexually active, just in case you didn't know that. And
Lesbians too,
Too, right?
Thank you. Exactly. So aging and sexuality, I think, are things that we need to talk about very openly. And as much as queer youth need all the attention and love that they can get, I think that our queer elders need love also.
Amen to that.
I'm interested, Rev Kev, that I've been seeing a lot of postings on my Facebook page, and it must be an AI generated thing. But there have been several archaeological discoveries in Europe and in Britain from the Roman era, many of which are dildos that were used by the Romans way back thousands of years ago. But at some point in time, I think it might have been because of Albert, Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, who was a prude, a German prude. Maybe it was because of him that we have this heavy stricture on sex and sexuality in our communities today.
But this is, okay, I'm a preacher. All right, so that is crazy to me when the religiosity of all of this, the Christendom, the patriarchal, puritanical energy doesn't, wants to be biblical, but it is God who says to a naked Adam and Eve, who told you you were naked? Where did this come from? Which by design suggests it did not come from me. I made you naked. I didn't put you in, the leaves and the clothing. I made you naked, and now you're aware of it. And we just keep being re-triggered to be reminded about your nakedness, your gayness, your blackness, your fat buttness, your lipness, where people are trying to get people back in check. And so that religion and the other thing that came up from the movie, that bullying becomes this kind of get in order, when the truth is, Minister Starlett is saying this in the chat, and it's a thing that I'm thinking about as we sit here. Like, it is almost not until one gets into like recovery that there is I need help, so I get a sponsor. My sponsor got a sponsor. My sponsor has a sponsor. Like, everybody honors. We're in this program because we all need help and support. It's almost the only place in the world where people are that vulnerable and that truthful, right? And so how do we get back there? Because as you said, the dildos, the etchings of finding two corpses, two bodies curled up together, and they're both men, the drawings, it's like, so you made homosexuality up. Listen, you shall not lay with a man as you lay with a woman. It's an abomination from Leviticus. It wouldn't be in the Bible if a man wasn't already laying with another man. It wouldn't have been a need. They don't have any references to helicopters in the Bible because there were no helicopters. But there were men laying with men, right? And so it's like we gotta bring some critical thinking into these conversations. And people are dropping amazing notes. Check out Trauma Stewardship by Laura von Donat Lipsky. Loretta put in there. There was a Princeton study that somebody put in. So please go through the chat. But let's unpack that. How do we get all of this stuff stripped down so that I need some help? Let me talk to somebody. Because even the young people seem to be talking to each other, but they're not talking about anything.
But Rev Kev, Denise.
Let's let Denise have this first.
I want to just throw in there the power of a major social work school, and I think that I don't want people that the only way you can get some is from individual therapy. There is a lot of power in group dynamics, all the mutual aid in group work. There's so many supports there for folks to join different types of groups. You don't even have your house to be a group. You could do that virtually. So I just want to plug in for that, because
please drop that in the chat, Denise, because that's a real thing. So Doc, Antoine, I always call him Doc. You're Dr. Kevin. Antoine, let's unpack that institute you're talking about, because it goes right into the space that Denise is talking about. It's not always a sit down, lay on the couch as in Hollywood movies. There are other structures that can help.
Yeah. So just let me just go back a little bit, because Denise put in the chat, vicarious trauma is real. Okay. And one of the conversations that many in our Black and people of color communities are not having, or at least I don't hear it, and it seems kind of like blasé, is the impact of lots of legislations and actions by white Republicans and evangelicals on Black and people of color bodies. Those are conversations we need to have, but we are not having them. It's just like, let's focus on the next music. Let's focus on the next show. Let's focus on something else, except that there are states in the South that are passing over 460 bills around the country about to demonize being LGBT. So I'm just going to drop that and leave that there for a minute. We can come back and discuss this, that's fine. But like you asked, I'm going to fire off this other rocket now about the ancestral.
Go ahead, I'm trying to get you to focus, I understand.
I've been focused, honey.
Well, no, but you can't go back to her voracious trauma point and walk past it, because you're right. And for us as queer people, for us as Black people, for some people who are Black and queer and you know what I mean? It's like all of this stuff comes up, and you feel that vicarious trauma when a cop pulls beside you. Now it's when you go to your own door to pick up a package. Now it's, there was a guy who I just saw today who was in a 7-Eleven, and a cop walked up beside him as he was getting a Slurpee. And as he reached for the handle, the cop reached for his gun. Like, I could say you were reaching for something and do whatever I want. And he was like, man, really? And the cop just laughed. And it's like, why would you do that in 2023, except that you understand the energy and the action of vicarious trauma? You understand what it's doing to a person. You know, you understand what it means to say you're pulling me over for running a light, but you put your hand on your gun. It's a traffic stop, right? And so all of those triggerings pour into these conversations that people are having, and and they speak at some level to our siblings, from the white community. It's like we get triggered and triggered and triggered and triggered. And maybe instead of always thinking we got to come together in a hut of 100, maybe we go to our respective spaces to heal our collective energy. So let's talk about the Institute.
So like I was talking about just now, is that when we want to talk about mental health, about therapists being culturally sensitive, culturally humble, culturally competent, I hate using culturally sensitive, but that cultural sensitivity goes a couple of different sides and angles. The therapists themselves need to know their story. They need to be in touch with their own lives, do the work on themselves to heal their own trauma and understand their own intergenerational and transgenerational trauma, as well as their contemporaneous trauma, before they can begin to deal with clients that coming in their office. But the Ancestral Institute that we have launched seems to us to be the next logical step to providing care and healing for Black and people of color, so that Black and people of color can go to therapists who may, for example, have come to understand their own story there and come to be able to connect with their ancestral healing practices, can one day say to a client, next time you're coming, bring your drum and meet me at this drum circle, and we'll do some drumming. Or the therapist might be able to say to a client, meet me in the park, and we'll just do some meditation. Okay?
Yep.
That's the kind of thing that I'm just making what I'm saying is actually very simplified. But that
I've had one of my best therapy sessions was a walk. It was a 2-hour walk and we talked the whole time, but it was in context and in that space. Like just when I tried to clam up, a bird chirped and I was like, okay.
But Rev Kev, thank you for sharing that, because consider when our ancestors were dealing with or treating their own family members or members from their community, either as the shaman or a village elder, how would they engage with that person under a tree, at a drumming circle, going for a walk, going and take a bath, and rubbing down with herbs and bushes and so forth? Okay? And we sit and we suggest with this Ancestral Institute that each of us, especially if you're Black and a person of color, your ancestors' rites and rituals and practices are in your DNA. Because consider, for example, I like to cook. And when I stand at my kitchen and I stand at that stove and I'm stirring a pot, I'm making a stew, I might get the smell that it might need a little bit of something. I don't take a teaspoon and measure precisely how many milligrams and how many centigrade. No, I just grab a little bit with a finger, with a hand, and I sprinkle. And when I sprinkle, I think I had, all right, just good enough. Where did that come from?
Right.
I never knew to do that.
And it might be why the kitchen is such a cultural gathering space, because in those spaces, the women of the community, the cookers of the community,
gather around the pot.
Yeah.
We gather for substance, but the pot is not just sustenance. The pot is physical sustenance. Because when we gather around the pot, we are relaxed, we are sharing stories, we are talking, we are laughing, we are arguing, we may even have a little bit of a fight, but it's happening around the pot. Because if you think about humans, there are significant moments when we are most vulnerable. When we're sleeping and our defenses are down. When we're sleeping, when we're eating, when we are laughing with another, and when we're having sex, or we just finished having sex. Those are the 4 key moments when, as humans, our vulnerability is down, our defenses are down.
So Denise and Kevin, Doc, I'm talking to Kevin, and Kevin, because here's the thing I want to unpack, because a name was mentioned earlier in this conversation, Antoine. I want to be vulnerable in this moment. That triggered me, because in a moment, so real quick story. So I had been involved with the young singer Aaliyah, you know, and was on the last shoot. The one that took her life, who was supposed to be on the plane with her, and BET, understanding that it was a very big deal, was like, here, we're going to give you this therapist, and, you know, so you can talk to. And, you know, I thought, wow, looks like me. He'll probably get me and understand the struggle of Black man and always having to da-da-da-da. And I called his phone and poured my heart out, literally like a 15-minute message. You know, but it was after work, so I knew he wouldn't hear it. So the next day, not waiting on him, but taking my Virgo initiative, I called the next day and say, hey, this is so-and-so. I called last night and left you that message. And he said the most triggering thing to me, who's a community leader, an access person, a support system, a pastoral therapist. He said, I got your message. I forgot all about you. And I have been living with that in my DNA for 20 plus years now. How do we get past moments where we made the attempt and the connection wasn't right, and we use it, as I've tried a couple of times, and the thing that keeps coming back with me and therapists is that I forgot about you. Like, oh, you'll be fine. You seem like you're so strong, so if I miss an appointment and don't call you, you'll be fine. And and I realize with each trigger, I get younger and younger.
It's two points that I think address some of your questions there. One is there's a very famous and absolutely terrible but very real study that happened maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where they had a caller who was, you know, supposed to be identified as a BIPOC individual calling therapists and seeing if they can just make an appointment, just get in the door, just have an initial appointment. And some very, very small percentage of therapists ever return their call. They did the same thing with a white identified caller, still a minority, but a larger percentage of people called that person back. I mean, like, it's just awful in terms of access, in terms of, I mean, that's obviously a very clear instance of sort of racism, just in terms of who's just returning the phone calls. So I just want to say that I'm sorry that happened to you. That is awful. I wish I could say I think it's rare. I don't think it's rare. I think it's one of the things we've got to change. That's the first point. Second point, I tell everyone who's looking for a therapist, don't settle with the first therapist. Interview 3 people and choose the one you like most. And if you don't like any of them, do 4, 5, and 6. Because the therapist is a more important choice than, you know, do you see just one apartment, or do you look at a couple apartments? Do you buy the first house you look at? No, like you're important, and you need to resonate with that person, and you need to kind of keep going. And people feel like I don't want to do that. I want to start right now. I want to do that. I'm like, I know. And you're going to go farther. You're going to heal better and stronger and faster if you're with the right person. And so you need to do your homework on that, and you should see at least 3 people. So that's 2 points.
So if I could, the second part that for you, Dr. Moore, so that you can be ready to answer it as well, Denise. What does that process look like? You know, because now you got commercials saying you're ready to look for, here's blankety blank. Here's blankety blank. So it's become a commercial thing, but when you tell people to do the interviewing and they don't know how, what does that look like? What's the first question you should ask a therapist to see if you're a good fit?
So you mentioned that the trauma that you were dealing with at that point, at that time, you had 15 minutes that was just dying to get out of you, right? I would say to someone, I'm looking for someone, I'm not sure who I need to work with. Can do you give a gratis and initial session to see if we might work together, right? I mean, you want to start there. The people who don't do that, maybe they're not in the right profession. And so I start there, say your 15 minutes, and then say, what are some initial thoughts you're having? What do you think about my story? Do you think, like, what do you think that you can help me? The job of the therapist is to answer some kind of way, whatever their method, whatever their, everyone's got their own sort of thing. But if they can't say to you, yeah, I think I can help you. Thank you for sharing. I don't know, like connecting on some sort of human level and giving you some professional assurance of hope. If they can't do that, walk out of that office, keep walking. You've got better things to do with your life and your time.
Denise?
Yeah, I mean, think about this so many different ways, but for most of the people that I work with, not into private therapy, and so going into I don't call it a clinic, but a center, looking for support. Generally, you have to take who they assign you to, and I think that's hard. But there are times where you recognize that, some needs. We do an intake and a matching, right? So that folks get someone who kind of meets their needs. It's not always a perfect science, and I need to do that, like, going back and saying this isn't working for me. But that's really hard. I'm gonna sugarcoat it. That's really hard, and it doesn't always work, and it's not always that clean. I think for a lot of therapists, in those types of settings, you have to really kind of be able to make some of that assessment yourself too, and be true to the person that you're working with about when things aren't working. And I don't think everybody is actually willing to do that. So, yeah.
Antoine?
No, I hear what both Dr. Moore and Denise are saying, and part of the thing that I do when I do my mental health first aid training, as well as part of DBGM's own work, is that we say to people like you were saying just now, Dr. Moore, is that a therapist for you is like a friend. You building a relationship with someone, except that that friend is a little bit more removed or professional. They see you objectively. But you still need to enter into a relationship with that person. And we suggest to people, see not one, but two, but three, maybe four. Interview them. Because each of those people that you are going to be seeing and talking to will be interviewing you to see if they can handle your case, to see if you'll keep your appointments, but more importantly, if you have enough insurance or you can pay for the session. Okay, that's it. And so we suggest that when you go see a therapist, you ask the therapist a couple of questions, especially if you happen to be a Black gay man. How comfortable are you with Black history? Do you know Black history? That's the first. How comfortable or how comfortable or how do you feel about someone who's Black and gay? Or about LGBT and the LGBT community? That's the second question. And if none of those two questions can be answered properly to your satisfaction, then say, thank you very much for seeing me, and just get up and leave. Because we suggest to people, just as you will not go to a church and have a pastor tell you you're an abomination, and you still got to turn around and put money in the collection basket, so literally you are paying to be insulted. Why would you go see a therapist, to pay a therapist to continue to reinforce the shame and stigma and the ostracism that the rest of the community does to you? I recall hearing a story of someone telling me, going to see a therapist, and after about 3 or 4 sessions, the therapist says, you know what? And this is a Black gay man. You need to give your life to Jesus.
But say, okay, I hear you, and I want each of you to prepare your closing statements, right? But that's where this point, Antoine, is so imperative, because we've absorbed so much trauma and so much vicarious trauma, as Denise said earlier, that when you ask somebody how they feel about what they know about Black history or what do they feel about being Black and gay, they're going to give you the same answer that most pastors would. Most pastors don't tell you that first Sunday, they'll call you an abomination. You sitting there minding your business, listening to the choir, they get slapped in the face with doctrine that wasn't the stuff they preached for 10 Sundays. So this interviewing process, I think you summed it up by reminding each of us that, as you did, Dr. Moore, that when you sit with, with therapists, that you're interviewing them, right? That they have to kind of win your trust. And if they don't have that, for you to be fine and just get up, get out. That's it. You don't have to do anything else. You are welcome, you're welcome to leave. So as we close this conversation about mental health and wellness in the LGBT community, I'm going to give each of you 2 minutes. Somebody's hearing you in this 2 minutes on YouTube by itself. Make your standalone plea for somebody to do the work to take care of themselves, mind, body, and spirit. Antoine, you got first.
Oh, hell, man.
Yeah, because if I leave you on the back end, you'll think you got more time. Go first.
So
first, watch his film if you have not watched the film, because it may unpack some real conversation for you.
But it would help you understand.
Yep.
Watching the film would help you understand some of what this conversation is about.
Absolutely.
But more importantly, I would suggest, most importantly, I would suggest to an individual who may be struggling and trying to understand how to fit in, how to be a part of, how to learn about themselves, is, yes, getting a therapist. And a therapist, like we were saying earlier, who gets you, who understands you, who you connect with. But that is getting a therapist is part of your self-care. You also have to do your own self-care. So your self-care is going to be involved with doing some reading, asking questions of family members, learning your own story. Second, your personal self-care, getting enough sleep, taking a bath, eating healthy foods, because we know there's a connection between your gut and your brain. You are literally what you eat. And if your self-care involves some self-pleasure, baby, go for it. Because you should not be denied enjoying yourself.
Drop the mic. Drop the mic. Drop the mic.
The Roman dildos were made of stone. I mean, you might want to have some
were made of wood. Some were
made
of bone.
So much better.
Dr. Moore, go.
Yeah, okay. Self-care. Eat healthy, get a lot of sleep, exercise, have some fun in your life. Those are minimal self-care activities that you should do, and if you're not doing, you need to do those things. If you have a mental illness, which I think I defined earlier as like when you talk to important people in your life and you don't feel better over time, you should consider seeing a professional. I don't think it's the end all be all thing. I think there's many other important things to do besides that. And you should interview people, as I said. There's a great comment in chat that I want to put in my last 2 minutes, which is not everyone has the financial agency to do this. I think financial agency is exactly right. If you're going to invest money, you should invest money in something that's going to help you. And if you don't have the answers that Antoine had said, they're probably not going to help you. They might be trying to help you, but that even the therapists who are trying to do the right things and so forth don't understand enough about the BIPOC experience, the queer experience, the whatever, and that's not enough. And that the agency, I think, is the thing that part of healing yourself is sort of demanding that type of access. One final point, even at community mental health centers that see people with Medicaid or without insurance. That is the mission of community mental health centers in America. And yes, they have a wait list, and yes, there's ask for a supervisor and say, I have this issue, I need to be seen, here is why. And if they don't answer you, ask for their supervisor. Go the way up to the executive director. I've worked at these institutions for 20 years. I'm telling you that on a national basis, it is their mission to help you, but you have to ask for it and you might have to advocate in order to make that happen. Give yourself that agency so that you can heal and get access to the services that you may need. Thank you.
Denise Hines.
I'm going to end with the importance of relationships, because everybody can or wants to go to therapy. I think, you know, having relationships, creating community for yourself, talk a lot in the LGBTQIA community about chosen family, create that chosen family where you can get the support you need. To me, that is really important. When you start to feel, you know, triggered, depressed, anxious, who you go to for that kind of support. Have those, like, write those people down and make those phone calls. Don't close yourself to the support you might be able to get. I'm also going to continue to put the plug in for support groups. I think really, really beneficial. I think community spaces where you feel that sense of safety are really, really important. There are lots of groups in those community spaces where there are folks like you who want to support one another. And those to me would be really important. So I'm going to in for that. And just remembering that we all have, you know, trauma is everywhere. We all experience some level of trauma. It's what we do with that that's important, and finding ways to get yourself the support you need.
And I want everybody, so Sharon put something in the chat that I'd like to say something about, and then I'm going to ask Donna to come on and close us out. Sharon Falcon says, the film broke my heart, Antoine. She says, everyone needs to accept themselves, but if you have family support to protect you from trauma, it is paramount. And as a Black gay man, I know what it's like to have been in the church space on Mother's Day, and my mother was there in the space with us, and I asked her to stand so I could pay tribute to her. And in response, she paid tribute to the room and started singing, and she wasn't a singer, and I was shocked. And the bishop called her to the front and handed her the microphone. And she said, so many of y'all are struggling in this space because you want somebody to love you who doesn't love themselves. She said, but Big Mama love you. And she gave her phone number out twice to the whole church. So the day my mother died, she would get picked up on the street by people she didn't know. But she was like, well, I made it home alive, and they called me Mother Taylor. But when I went downstairs to the choir room and made my way back, my mother had a receiving line, Donna. And I sat down because I knew my mother was going to be that Black mama who was going to talk to everybody. And one of my friends said, Mother Taylor, I understand. He said, now I see where Kevin gets it from. And my mother said, baby, what you think you see is me on Kevin. The truth of this is what you see is Kevin on me. And so for everybody struggling in your identity, it is your bigness, your boldness, your bright light that scares everybody, because you came out. They're afraid you're going to come all the way out and shift the whole paradigm. And you just might. Donna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. This could have continued for a couple of days. It was so wonderful, important, insightful.
Thank you, Antoine. Thank you, Dr. Moore. Thank you, Denise Hines.
Yes, thank you, panel. On behalf of NJPAC, we really appreciate you sharing your expertise and inspiration. And certainly, you know, we'd like to also thank our LGBTQ employee resource group for curating this and really being determined. And Antoine, thank you for that incredible film. I really learned a lot watching that. And of course, I have to thank our audience, because you had a whole nother panel going on with the chats and the Q&A. So thank you for being present, you know, and sharing your thoughts and dynamic questions and comments. So of course, we do this every month. What's next month? May is Asian American Pacific Islanders Heritage Month, and we will be talking about the relationship, the power of Asian American and Black unity. So the title of this is Standing in Solidarity, Stronger Together, the Power of Asian American and Black Unity. That will be on Monday, May 22nd. And we talked so much about wellness. I wanted to remind everyone that NJPAC is hosting a wellness fair on Wednesday from 12 to 3 at NJPAC. It's free and open to the public. We're going to have all kinds of things. We'd explore wellness, with chair yoga, sound bath, massages, materials. So please join us if you have time. That's this Wednesday from 12 to 3. We're also very active in the communities, and we will be Clinton Hill on Saturday. On April 27th, Thursday, for our Arts Exchange kickoff. And this is a program that we've designed for over a year, to really be responsive to what would the community like to be engaged with us. And then if you want to get your dance on, come to Ailey Day all day long, Saturday at NJPAC. We will have free dance workshops inspired by Alvin Ailey choreography. There'll be a share with everyone showing off what they've learned together. So that's going to be a lot of fun. And then finally, for you young people in your life, our Arts Education Summer Program registration is open, and we turn no child away. So if they aren't able to pay for it, we find a way. But we would welcome any of your youth to sign up our Arts Education Summer Program. So thank you, family. This has been amazing.